You are listening to Reformed Thinking. Welcome to our latest deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Imagine you are standing in a clinic, looking at an x-ray. You have this pain in your arm, and the doctor snaps the image, throws it up on the light board, and points to a jagged white line.
Right, there it is, a fracture.
Yeah, it is binary. The bone is either broken or it is not. We love that kind of precision, We love things we can see, categorize, and treat with a really straightforward protocol.
We do. But then you step out of the clinic and into the world of ancient texts, historical linguistics, and theological interpretation.
Which is a completely different ballgame.
Oh, absolutely. Suddenly, that crisp, high-definition X-ray machine starts producing a whole lot of static. We start looking at a landscape that is incredibly murky.
The lines blur, the historical context shifts right beneath our feet.
And what looks like a clear, undeniable structural fracture to one linguistic specialist, well, it looks like a completely natural, intended formation to another.
It is the ultimate diagnostic challenge. You have multiple scholars looking at the very same primary source document, yet walking away with entirely different blueprints for how a community should function.
Precisely. And today, we are taking you into one of the most heavily scrutinized and contested passages in modern church history.
We are zeroing in on a single, highly detailed academic source for this session. It is an article titled Annotations on the Text and Message of 1 Timothy 2.1:15.
Yes, written by John A. Jelinek, Ph.D., and published in the Journal of Ministry and Theology back in the fall of 1998.
This paper provides a very charged. But we are not here to take sides. We are not here to declare winners and losers. Think of us as impartial reporters analyzing the architecture of a building.
Our job is simply to break down Jelinek's linguistic, historical, and grammatical arguments so that you can fully grasp the anatomy of the complementarian position as he presents it.
Setting that boundary is essential. We will be examining the mechanics of his argument. We will look at why he translates certain Greek words the way he does.
Right, and how he reconstructs the historical setting of the first century, and how he links this specific passage back to the opening chapters of Genesis.
The stakes of this conversation are staggering, honestly. We are talking about a massive theological debate affecting churches on a global scale.
And yet, this entire sweeping debate hinges on the translation of incredibly specific ancient Greek words.
Some of which only appear once in the entire New Testament.
Yeah, that is true. And, believe it or not, it also hinges on the interpretation of historical fashion trends and jewelry in the ancient city of Ephesus.
It sounds wild when you frame it like that. We are dealing with vocabulary that lacks extensive cross-referencing, alongside cultural cues about braided hair, gold, and pearls.
Cues that actually carry massive sociological weight.
So let us start with the reality on the ground. Why does a paper from 1998 about an ancient letter matter to anyone today?
To answer that, we really have to look at the demographics and the debate itself. Jelinek sets the stage by citing some fascinating statistics right at the beginning of his paper.
He points out that women make up almost 60% of the general church population.
60% is a clear, undeniable majority. He also references a 1991 Leadership magazine survey.
What did that survey find?
It reported that more than half of the churches surveyed had women currently serving on their church board or council.
So you have a scenario where the vast majority of people sitting in the pews are women.
Right. And a massive portion of the governing bodies include women. The burning question Jelinek addresses is how this modern practical reality interacts with the ancient biblical text.
That interaction is the collision point for two major theological camps. Jelinek defines these camps clearly, so let us make sure we have the definitions locked in for you.
On one side, we have the egalitarian view. This position is championed by conservative scholars like Gilbert Bilezikian and Catherine Kroger.
What is their main argument?
Their core argument is that roles within the church are open to all believers based entirely on spiritual gifting rather than gender.
Got it. So they advocate for a pastoral and teaching role for women.
Yes, basing their arguments on a specific exegesis of the New Testament that views certain restrictions as culturally temporary.
On the other side, representing the position Jelinek defends in his paper, is the complementarian view.
Right. The complementarian view holds that God created men and women equal in personhood, but distinct in their roles.
Scholars in this camp, people like Douglas Moo, George Knight, and Thomas Schreiner, they affirm male leadership.
They contend that within the church, certain governing and teaching roles are restricted to men by divine appointment, rather than cultural circumstance.
Equal in personhood, distinct in roles. proving that thesis from the text of 1 Timothy 2 is where the heavy lifting begins.
Jelinek identifies 5 major categories of difficulty in this specific passage. Think of these as 5 distinct battlegrounds where scholars clash.
Those 5 categories provide a brilliant map of the terrain. Walk us through them.
First, you have vocabulary. There is intense debate over specific Greek words, most notably ostentio and hesychia.
Okay, words are the first battleground. What is the second?
Second is grammar. How do the sentences link together? Are 2 words functioning as a single idea or 2 separate commands? How do conjunctions operate in the original language?
And the third?
Third is Old Testament citations. How does Paul's reference to Adam and Eve relate to his instructions for the church?
I know that third point is a massive flashpoint we will spend a lot of time on later.
Absolutely. Fourth is theology. This centers around the use of the word sozo, meaning saved, in verse 15. The concept of women being saved through childbearing is notoriously difficult.
And the final category?
The 5th category is history. What was the actual boots-on-the-ground historical situation in the church at Ephesus that prompted Paul to write this letter?
Let us pull the thread on that 5th point, history. If we want to understand Jelinek's argument, we have to understand Ephesus. This was not just some sleepy village, right?
Not at all. Ephesus was a major metropolis in the ancient world. It was a hub of commerce and religion, famous for the massive Temple of Artemis.
So what was the context of Paul writing this letter to Timothy?
Paul had left his protege, Timothy, in Ephesus with a very specific corrective mission. The broader context of 1 Timothy reveals that false teachers had infiltrated the church community.
What were they doing?
They were spreading myths, perhaps questionable genealogies, and generating a whole lot of chaos and division.
So Paul writes this letter to Timothy as a structural operating manual for the church.
Exactly. The sound teaching and godly living Paul prescribes act as a direct antidote to these false teachings.
He is telling Timothy to select qualified leaders, promote proper motives, and ensure proper conduct when the church gathers for worship.
Yeah, it is basically a guide for fixing a broken system.
I have always thought of reading one of Paul's letters, especially one addressing specific church problems, like listening to one half of a phone call.
That is a great way to picture it.
You are sitting in a room, and your friend is on the phone. You hear your friend say, no, do not cut the red wire under any circumstances.
But you have no idea what the person on the other end is looking at.
Right. You don't know what machine they are trying to fix or what the red wire actually connects to. You just hear the urgent instruction.
We only possess Paul's answers. We have to reverse engineer the specific problems in Ephesus based on the solutions he provides.
This leads to the ultimate question egalitarians ask and complementarians have to answer.
Which is, how do we know if Paul's instructions in 1 Timothy 2 are universal, timeless rules for all churches everywhere?
Or, on the flip side, if they are just local, temporary troubleshooting for a specific Ephesian problem?
That is the pivotal question of hermeneutics. Are we looking at a permanent architectural blueprint or an emergency memo meant to expire once the crisis passed?
How does Jelinek approach that?
Jelinek argues that to answer this, we must look meticulously at the immediate context of Paul's letter. We cannot just parachute into the highly controversial verses about women teaching.
So we have to start where Paul starts.
Yes, examining how he addresses the men in the congregation first.
Let us do that. We are moving into verses 1 through 10, looking at posture, prayer, and pearls. What is Paul telling the men in Ephesus to do?
In the opening verses, Paul highlights that God desires all people to be saved, which requires public prayers. He is very specific in verse 8.
What does he say?
He instructs the men in the house churches to pray. He commands them to pray, lifting holy hands up in prayer, without anger or disputing.
Jelinek's paper notes something interesting about the vocabulary here. There are actually 4 different Greek words for prayer used in this immediate context.
Yes.
Why use 4 different words for the same basic action?
The precision of the language shows Paul covering the entire spectrum of human communication with the divine. The first word is desis.
And what does desis mean?
It refers to specific, urgent requests or supplications. It is the kind of prayer you pray when there is an immediate need.
Okay, what is the second word?
The second is prohibition. That is the more general, comprehensive word for prayer directed to God.
Got it. And the third?
The third is ontokes, which carries the idea of intercession. It means stepping in on behalf of someone else or taking a conversational, confident approach to God.
And the fourth word is eucharistias, right?
Yes, meaning thanksgivings.
So he covers everything from desperate requests to simple gratitude. And he tells the men to do all this while lifting holy hands.
Now, to a modern listener, sitting in a contemporary church, that might sound like just a stylistic suggestion for a worship service.
But Jelinek digs into the historical roots of this phrase.
He does. The phrase is deeply embedded in Jewish custom. Lifting the hands, palms open and upward, was the traditional expected posture of prayer in the Old Testament.
And the early Christians just adopted that posture.
Right. The operative word in Paul's instruction, however, is holy. The lifting of hands was not just a physical stretch.
It was an outward symbol of moral purity.
Yes, you lift your hands to declare a clean conscience, to demonstrate that your hands are not stained by violence, theft, or sin.
This links directly to Paul's subsequent command that they pray without anger or disputing.
Which tells us something huge about the men in Ephesus.
Yeah, if Paul has to command them to stop being angry and disputing during prayer, things must have been pretty heated.
The men were apparently struggling with severe infighting, theological arguments, or relational conflict right in the middle of their worship gatherings.
Paul is calling them back to moral purity and peaceful intercession. He demands that they resolve their anger before they attempt to lead the congregation in prayer.
He addresses the internal purity and external demeanor of the men first. Then, in verses 9 and 10, he pivots to the women.
The language shifts drastically from prayer postures to wardrobe choices. He addresses their attire. No costly garments, no braided hair with gold or pearls.
Before we get into the fashion analysis, Jelinek tackles a significant grammatical debate that alters the scope of the passage entirely.
What is the debate?
Some scholars argue that because Paul talks about men in verse 8 and women in verse 9, he is actually addressing husbands and wives, not men and women in general.
Because the Greek words humor and gyne can be translated as husband and wife depending on the surrounding context.
Right.
If he is just telling wives how to act around their own husbands, that changes the trajectory of the entire text. It localizes it to the nuclear family rather than the church structure.
That is precisely the point of contention. However, Jelinek argues strongly that Paul is addressing women in general here, not just wives.
How does he support that?
He points out that limiting these commands to married couples makes very little logical sense in the context of a public worship gathering.
I see. Would Paul really only care about the peaceful prayer life of married men and the modesty of married women?
Yeah, leaving the single men to argue and the single women to wear whatever they want, it just doesn't fit.
Jelinek, aligning with scholars like Douglas Moo, concludes that the context points to men and women generally within the corporate worshiping community.
With that established, we have Paul addressing all the women in the Ephesian church. He tells them not to wear costly garments, braided hair, gold, or pearls.
What exactly was happening in Ephesus that prompted an apostolic dress code?
We have to look at the historical context of Ephesian economics and fashion. Some egalitarian scholars, most notably the Krogers, have proposed a rather dramatic theory.
Oh, what is their theory?
They suggest Paul's warning is directed at women who were literally disrobing or wearing highly suggestive garments associated with pagan mystery cults.
Wow.
Yeah, perhaps mimicking the ecstatic celebrations of Dionysus or the fertility rituals of Artemis right there in the Christian worship service.
That is quite a mental image. People acting out frenzied pagan rituals in the middle of a home church gathering. I imagine that would certainly prompt a letter from Paul.
You would think so. But Jelinek does not buy the mystery cult theory at all.
Why does he dismiss it?
He dismisses it as lacking textual support. He states there is nothing in the immediate context of 1 Timothy to suggest such extreme, blatant pagan activities were occurring within the Christian gatherings.
So what does Jelinek argue the prohibition targets instead?
He argues it targets something much more common and arguably more insidious in a church community: ostentatious wealth and seductive clothing.
Ostentatious wealth. So we are really talking about class division here.
Yes. Notice Paul uses the phrase costly garments. In the Greco-Roman world, the socioeconomic gap between the wealthy elite and the urban poor or slave classes was monumental.
And some members of the Ephesian church were likely extremely wealthy.
Right. For a wealthy woman to show up to a small house church gathering where slaves and day laborers were present draped in gold, pearls, and incredibly expensive fabrics would severely alienate the poorer believers.
It would reduce them to second-class status within a community that was supposed to be unified in Christ.
It was a visual display of societal power that destroyed spiritual unity.
Jelinek also connects this extreme adornment to seduction. To back this up, he brings in references from ancient literature to show how people in the first century viewed these specific fashion choices.
The quotes he provides give incredible cultural flavor.
He references the apocryphal book of 1 Enoch, chapter 8, verses 1 and 2. Just to clarify for our listener, 1 Enoch is not in the standard biblical canon, so why is Jelinek quoting it here?
That is a great clarification. Scholars use intertestamental literature like 1 Enoch not as inspired scripture, but as historical dictionary.
It shows us the cultural mindset, right? The idioms and the assumptions of Jewish people living around the first century.
Spot on. Jelinek quotes it to prove how a first-century Jewish Christian mind, like Paul's, would have interpreted gold and braided hair.
The quote from 1 Enoch describes fallen angels teaching humanity sinful practices.
It says they taught people how to make weapons of war, but also how to make bracelets, decorations, ornamentation, the beautifying of the eyelids, all kinds of precious stones.
The text explicitly links this new knowledge of extreme artificial adornment to wickedness, fornication, and corruption.
He also quotes from the book of Judith, another ancient text. In chapter 10, Judith takes off her widow's garments, washes herself, and anoints herself with costly ointment.
And she braids her hair, puts on bracelets, chains, rings, earrings, and all sorts of ornaments.
Yes, and the text explicitly says she did this to allure the eyes of all men that should see her.
Those references are critical for Jelinek's argument. He uses them to demonstrate that in the Jewish and early Christian mind, extravagant, costly adornment was intimately linked with sexual seductiveness.
And moral corruption. The braided hair, Paul mentions, was not just a simple, practical way to keep hair out of one's face.
In the Roman world, wealthy women wore elaborate, towering coiffures woven with gold combs and pearls.
These hairstyles took slaves hours to construct. It was a blatant display of wealth, idleness, and a potential tool of seduction.
I hear what Jelinek is saying about the historical context of hair and gold, but this brings up a major pushback from the egalitarian side.
It is a very logical question for a modern person to ask.
Right. If modern Christians, even conservative complementarian Christians, do not enforce a literal ban on braided hair, gold rings, and pearls today, isn't it completely hypocritical to turn around and enforce the teaching restrictions in the very next verse, literally?
It is a sharp, persistent critique. You have people wearing wedding rings and pearl necklaces while citing this passage to restrict women from teaching.
It strikes at the heart of biblical hermeneutics. If the pearls are dismissed as merely cultural, why isn't the teaching ban dismissed as cultural too?
How does Jelinek respond to that charge of inconsistency?
Well, Jelinek counters by distinguishing between the core, timeless principle and the temporary cultural application of that principle.
He points out that Paul actually gives the core principle right there in verse 9. Women are to adorn themselves with modesty and discretion.
The Greek words are eidis kai sophrosines, so that attitude of modesty is the universal command.
Yes, the principle is modesty, not the total absence of pearls.
In first-century Ephesus, modesty and discretion meant avoiding the gold-woven hair and pearls that specifically signaled arrogance, immense wealth, and seduction in that particular Greco-Roman culture.
Today, the cultural markers of arrogance and seduction look different. A simple pearl necklace does not signal a towering class divide in modern society the way it did then.
The specific application of avoiding pearls has changed with the culture, but Jelinek argues the core command for a modest and discreet attitude remains fully binding.
The clothing and the jewelry were the external symptoms of a deeper disorder in the Ephesian church.
If the jewelry was just an outward symptom of a power struggle, how does Paul address the actual power dynamics in the room?
That leads us into verses 11 and 12, where Paul shifts from the wardrobe to the classroom. He moves from attire to authority.
This is where the exegetical battle truly intensifies. The vocabulary here is debated so heavily. Let us lay out the text first.
Verse 11 commands women to learn. The Greek word is mentheneto, in quietness, or hesychia.
And in all submissiveness, which is hypotosh.
Then we hit verse 12, containing the double prohibition that forms the bedrock of the complementarian view.
Paul writes, I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. The Greek words there are didaskain and authentaine.
Jelinek's entire case rests on the precise definitions and syntactical relationships of these specific Greek words. Let us start with verse 11. Learning in quietness, or hesychia.
When a modern reader hears the word quietness, they immediately think of absolute silence. They picture a strict library where you are shushed if you even whisper.
Right, but is Paul telling the women to never speak a single word in church?
Jelinek argues no. He says that hesychia means a quiet demeanor, a tranquil attitude, or a peaceable spirit. It is not an absolute prohibition on making any vocal sound.
He points to 1 Corinthians 11, where Paul explicitly acknowledges and allows women to pray and prophesy out loud in the church gatherings.
If hesychia meant absolute silence, 1 Corinthians 11 would be a glaring, irreconcilable contradiction.
Exactly. Spot on. So it is about a peaceful, non-disruptive attitude rather than a vow of silence.
Yes, it contrasts sharply with the chaotic, disputing attitude that Paul rebuked the men for earlier in the chapter. This quiet demeanor is paired with hypotage, translated as all submissiveness.
Submissiveness is an incredibly loaded word today, often carrying connotations of oppression or lack of agency.
How does the Greek define it in this context?
Hypotage pairs the voluntary act of placing oneself in a subordinate position with an inward attitude of respect.
It isn't forced subjugation or mindless compliance.
No, it is a willing disposition of respect toward the established order and those placed in leadership.
To illustrate how these concepts function together, Jelinek highlights a fascinating structural theory proposed by Douglas Moo regarding a chiasm.
For a listener who might not be a student of ancient literature, a chiasm is a literary device where thoughts are organized symmetrically.
Right, like a mirror image, usually ABCBA. The center point is the main focus, and the outer points parallel each other.
But how did an oral culture experience a chiasm? Did they notice it intuitively, or is this just a modern scholar drawing lines on a whiteboard?
Oral cultures were highly attuned to structural repetition. They did not have printed Bibles to scan with highlighters, so they relied on auditory cues.
A chiasm functions like a musical refrain. When they heard the opening idea repeated at the end, it created an auditory bracket.
Drawing their mental focus to whatever sat in the middle of those brackets. Moo suggests Paul frames his argument symmetrically here to reinforce the connection between the commands.
The structure looks roughly like this. Point A is, let a woman in quietness.
Point B is learn.
Point C, the center, is in all submissiveness.
Then point B prime is, I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man.
And point A prime closes it out. But to remain in quietness.
The concept of quietness creates the auditory bookends around the whole thought.
It creates what scholars call an inclusio, sealing the idea. The center point, submissiveness, is directly linked to the prohibition of teaching and exercising authority.
Moo's structure visually and audibly demonstrates that the submissiveness required is specifically a submission to the male teachers who hold authority in the congregation.
It is not a generic submission to all men everywhere, but specific to the teaching authority in the church assembly.
That structural argument is compelling, but the real heat, the absolute center of this debate, is generated by the word authentine in verse 12.
I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority, authentine, over a man.
Authentine is incredibly difficult to nail down because it is a hapax legonon.
That means it is a word that appears only once in the entire New Testament.
When you only have one usage to look at, you cannot compare how Paul uses it in his letter to the Romans or the Galatians to deduce its meaning. You are flying blind within the biblical text itself.
Wait, if it is only used once in the whole New Testament, how can Jelinek or anyone else possibly be so confident in what it means? Aren't they just guessing based on their own theological bias?
That is a fair challenge. To avoid guessing, scholars have to rely entirely on extra-biblical ancient Greek literature.
They have to scour papyri, ancient tax receipts, personal letters, and official decrees to figure out how the average Greek speaker in the first century used the word.
Your egalitarians have analyzed these extra-biblical texts and argued that the word has a very negative, aggressive connotation.
They suggest it means to usurp authority, to murder, to act violently, or to domineer in a destructive way.
If that egalitarian reading is true, then Paul is not stopping women from holding normal, healthy leadership roles. He's just stopping them from being tyrannical, usurping leaders.
He's basically saying, don't be a domineering dictator.
That is the core egalitarian defense. However, Jelinek relies on an exhaustive landmark study conducted by scholar H. Scott Baldwin.
Baldwin did not just look at a few examples. He analyzed the usage of authentine and its related noun forms across a vast, comprehensive array of ancient Greek literature spanning centuries.
What did Baldwin find when he looked at all those external documents?
Baldwin concluded that while the word can occasionally carry negative overtones depending on the specific context of a sentence, the single unifying concept across all its usages is simply the objective concept of authority.
It refers to the possession or exercise of authority, neutral in itself.
Yes. It doesn't inherently mean an abusive, violent, or usurping kind of authority.
Based on Baldwin's data, Jelinek argues Paul is simply prohibiting women from exercising objective authority over men in the church, not just prohibiting them from being abusive about it.
Let us layer in another grammatical puzzle Jelinek tackles regarding verse 12. It is the concept of a verbal hendiates.
This sounds incredibly technical, but it is vital for understanding how the sentence works.
A hendiates is a figure of speech where two separate words connected by and or are used to express one single complex idea.
Instead of saying the tea is nice and warm, meaning it has two separate qualities, you mean the tea is nicely warm.
Some egalitarian scholars, like Philip Payne, argue that the two verbs teach and exercise authority, which are connected by the Greek negative conjunction eud, form a verbal hendiates.
They argue that the second term modifies the first term adverbially.
So instead of two separate prohibitions, do not teach and do not exercise authority, it becomes one single modified prohibition. Do not teach in a domineering way.
If it is a hendiates, then normal, healthy teaching is totally fine, as long as the woman doing it is not being domineering.
That would be the logical conclusion. But Jelinek, leaning heavily on the extensive syntactical research of Andreas Kostenberger, vehemently rejects the hendiates argument.
Why does Kostenberger reject it? How does he prove it is not a hendiates?
Kostenberger conducted a massive syntactical study of sentences using the conjunction ood throughout the New Testament and extra-biblical literature.
He looked at how the grammar functions when oud joins two verbs.
And he found that oud consistently coordinates two separate, distinct concepts that share the same polarity. They're either both positive or both negative.
It does not blend them into one adverbially modified concept.
Kostenberger concludes that the syntactical parallels simply do not support the idea that exercising authority just modifies teaching. They're two distinct, albeit related, activities that Paul is independently prohibiting.
Let us look closely at the first of those two distinct activities, teaching. The Greek word is didaskein.
I want to use an analogy to help clarify what kind of teaching Paul is actually talking about here, because we use the word teaching very broadly today. Think about a modern university.
Okay, let's follow that analogy.
In a university setting, there is a massive difference between a student participating in a seminar discussion, sharing a brilliant insight, or even leading a casual study group, versus the person who holds the tenured position of the lead lecturer.
Right. The tenured lecturer sets the official curriculum, grades the exams, determines what is true for the course, and officially represents the authority of the academic institution.
Does didaskein mean any kind of sharing of information, like the seminar discussion? Or does it mean a specific authoritative kind of teaching, like the tenured lecturer?
Jelinek clarifies that didaskein, specifically as it is used in the pastoral epistles, refers to the tenured lecturer role in your analogy.
It denotes the authoritative public transmission of Christian doctrine based on apostolic tradition.
It is the official, recognized teaching office of the church responsible for guarding the truth of the gospel.
So Paul is not saying a woman can never speak a true fact about God or share a theological insight.
Not at all. Jelinek points out that the command is not a blanket ban on female speaking. The prohibition in verse 12 takes the generic word for man andros as its object.
Women are not to teach men in this official authoritative capacity, but Paul actively commands women to teach other women and children.
Jelinek references Titus 2, where older women are explicitly instructed to teach the younger women.
And in 2 Timothy, Paul praises Timothy's mother and grandmother for teaching him the scriptures from childhood.
The restriction is highly specific. It is placed on the elder-level teaching office directed over men and the congregation as a whole.
Summarizing this section, Jelinek argues that the grammar, the syntax of odd, and the objective definition of ostentatious office prove Paul is restricting women from the official authoritative teaching office over men,
requiring them instead to learn with a respectful, subordinate demeanor.
That is the structural foundation of the complementarian reading of verses 11 and 12.
Now, an egalitarian could listen to everything we just said and reply, okay, I concede the Greek. Maybe Paul is restricting them from the official office.
But he's only doing it because the women in Ephesus were currently uneducated in the first century, or they were currently being deceived by those false teachers we talked about.
Once they get educated, once the false teaching is dealt with, the ban lifts. Up to verse 12, Paul could still just be reacting to unruly Ephesian congregations.
That is a very common argument. But that brings us to verses 13 and 14. This is where Paul drops his theological anchor,
shifting away from the cultural problems of the first century and reaching all the way back to the dawn of humanity.
Let us read the text. Verse 13 begins with a vital connecting word, for, in Greek, gar.
For Adam was created first, then Eve.
Then verse 14 says, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was thoroughly deceived and became a transgressor.
The Greek word gar is the hinge on which the entire complementarian argument swings. Jelinek notes that gar provides the basis, the ground, the specific reason for the command Paul just issued in verse 12.
Why are women not permitted to teach or exercise authority over men? Gar. Because Adam was created first.
Jelinek views Paul's appeal to the Genesis creation account as absolute proof that the prohibition is not a temporary local cultural accommodation.
If Paul wanted to give a cultural temporary reason, he easily could have. He could have written, for the women in Ephesus are currently unlearned.
Or, for the false teachers are tricking the women right now.
Instead, he bypasses Ephesian culture, bypasses educational status, and points directly to the pre-fall creation order.
Jelinek, agreeing with Douglas Moo, argues that Paul's reading of Genesis 2 understands chronological priority in creation as carrying a measure of inherent authority.
Adam was formed first, establishing a divine pattern of headship before sin ever entered the world.
Egalitarians push back hard against this reading of Genesis. They have a completely different explanation for why Paul suddenly brings up Adam and Eve.
Let us look at their arguments so we can understand Jelinek's rejection of it. Egalitarian scholars, such as Gordon Fee and the Krogers, suggest that the false teachers in Ephesus were peddling a specific kind of local proto-Gnostic myth.
Let us define what that means, because proto-Gnostic is heavy theological jargon.
Right, Gnostic. What does that mean in the context of first-century Ephesus, and why would it appeal to people?
Gnosticism was a movement that gained massive traction in the 2nd century, but early forms of it, proto-Gnosticism, were brewing in Paul's day. It was built on the idea of secret knowledge.
It taught that the physical, material world was evil and the spiritual world was good.
In some of these Gnostic myths, they completely flipped the Genesis narrative. Instead of the serpent being the bad guy, the serpent was a hero offering secret spiritual enlightenment.
Under this twisted myth, Eve was glorified over Adam because she was brave enough to take the fruit, eat it, and gain the secret knowledge, while Adam remained ignorant.
Under that theory, Paul is not making a universal rule about male headship. He is just doing damage control.
He is saying, stop teaching this crazy Ephesian myth that Eve is better than Adam. Let's get the story straight. Adam came first, and Eve wasn't enlightened. She was tricked.
That is the egalitarian proposition. They argue Paul is correcting a local heresy, not establishing a universal gender hierarchy.
But Jelinek systematically dismantles that theory based on the actual text of 1 Timothy. He asks a devastatingly logical question.
What is that?
If combating false teaching was the only issue at hand, why didn't Paul ban the false male teachers from speaking too?
Because 1 Timothy explicitly names male false teachers. He mentions guys like Hymenaeus and Alexander by name.
If the goal was simply to stop false teaching, a blanket ban on women teaching makes absolutely no sense, especially when men were actively spreading catastrophic errors in the same community.
Why silence all women but only excommunicate specific men?
Furthermore, Jelinek argues there is zero textual warrant for importing this elaborate proto-Gnostic Eve myth into the passage. Paul doesn't mention Gnosticism or secret knowledge here.
He simply prohibits women from teaching men based on the objective order of creation.
Moo points out that importing such highly specific, speculative local factors without clear textual warrant is a dangerous methodology.
If you can invent an unstated historical background to negate the plain reading of a text, you could use that method to dismiss any difficult teaching of Scripture.
Let us tackle verse 14, which is arguably even more uncomfortable for a modern reader. Adam was not deceived, but the woman was thoroughly deceived and became a transgressor.
The Greek word is exapathisa. It suggests a complete, thorough deception by Satan.
The prefix "ek" on that verb intensifies the meaning. She wasn't just slightly confused, she was utterly misled.
I have to press you on this. I read a verse like that and I have to ask, does this text mean that women, by their very nature, are ontologically more gullible or more prone to deceit than men?
Because throughout history, plenty of interpreters have used this exact verse to argue that women are intellectually weaker.
It has absolutely been weaponized that way in history, but Jelinek firmly says no. He rejects the idea that women are ontologically more gullible.
If Paul actually believed women were inherently gullible and easily tricked by the devil, He would never have commanded them to teach children and younger women, as we discussed in Titus 2.
You would not put the most easily deceived demographic in charge of forming the theology of the most vulnerable, impressionable minds in the congregation. It makes no pastoral sense.
If it is not about women being naturally gullible, what on earth is Paul's point about Eve taking the fruit? Why highlight her deception and Adam's lack of deception?
Jelinek outlines a theological theory proposed by Thomas Schreiner to explain the mechanics of the fall in this specific context.
Schreiner suggests that the serpent strategy was not just about getting humans to eat a piece of fruit.
It was a calculated attack to subvert the divine pattern of leadership. Notice a crucial detail in Genesis 3. It says Adam was with her during the temptation.
He was not off naming animals in another part of the garden. He was standing right there.
He was present, but the serpent deliberately bypassed Adam and approached Eve. In doing so, the serpent ignored the created order.
And Eve, by taking the initiative to respond to the serpent, negotiate the theology, and make the unilateral decision regarding the fruit, usurped the leadership role.
Meanwhile, Adam, the appointed head who received the command directly from God, passively allowed it to happen without intervening. He abandoned his post.
Let me try refining an analogy to picture Schreiner's theory. Imagine a commercial airliner in flight.
Okay.
You have the captain in the left seat and the co-pilot in the right seat. The air traffic control tower, which in this analogy is the serpent, an unauthorized tower giving malicious coordinates radios the plane.
But instead of talking to the captain, the tower deliberately bypasses him and gives instructions to the co-pilot.
A direct subversion of the hierarchy.
The co-pilot, instead of deferring to the captain or verifying the order, accepts the new, dangerous coordinates and begins altering the flight path.
The disaster here isn't just that the co-pilot took bad coordinates.
The disaster is that the captain sits silently in the neighboring seat, abdicating his responsibility, watching the plane veer off course, and eventually just going along with it.
That captures Schreiner's view perfectly. Schreiner views the Genesis temptation as a parable of role reversal. It is a terrifying picture of what happens when male leadership is abrogated.
Eve was deceived in the very process of stepping out from under the protective order of creation.
And Adam sinned by passively failing to lead and protect his wife. Therefore, Paul cites this not to say women are gullible, but to illustrate the catastrophic results of subverting God's designed roles.
The prohibition against women teaching men is a structural safeguard. It is meant to maintain the created order and prevent a repeat of that original devastating role reversal within the church community.
We have covered a massive amount of theological and historical ground.
Paul anchors his church structure not in Ephesian culture, but in the Genesis creation order and the mechanics of the fall.
But then, right when the argument seems complete, Paul ends the paragraph with verse 15. This brings us to the enigma of salvation and childbearing.
Enigma is the perfect word. Jelinek himself admits this verse is incredibly frustrating for commentators to interpret.
Verse 15 states, "But women shall be preserved or saved through the bearing of children if they continue in faith and love and sanctity with self-restraint."
Saved through childbearing, that phrase sounds jarring to modern ears. Scholars have fought over this for centuries.
Let us methodically list the 6 possible interpretations provided in Jelinek's paper. Here are the 6 representative views Jelinek identifies in the academic world.
View 1. Women will be saved spiritually, even though they must suffer the pain of bearing children.
View 2. Women will be delivered physically through the dangerous process of childbirth.
View 3. Women will be saved spiritually through the childbearing, referring specifically to the birth of Jesus Christ.
View 4. Women will be saved spiritually equally with men through fulfilling their God-given role in the home.
View 5. Women will be kept safe from the temptation of seizing men's roles in the church by fulfilling their role in the home.
View 6. Women will be saved spiritually with faithfulness to their proper role, pictured in motherhood, acting as the outward evidence of that genuine salvation.
That is a huge spectrum of options. Let us act like theological detectives and systematically eliminate the incorrect views based on Jelinek's textual analysis.
Let us start with view 2. Physical preservation during childbirth. A lot of modern Bible translations actually lean this way, translating the verse as "she will be kept safe through childbirth."
It sounds like a comforting promise.
It sounds comforting, but Jelinek discards this view for 2 massive reasons. First, it is demonstrably, tragically untrue in human experience. Faithful, godly, deeply spiritual Christian women die in childbirth.
If this is an apostolic promise of physical safety for faithful women, it is a promise that routinely fails.
Second, he looks closely at Paul's vocabulary. The Greek word used is sozo. While sozo can occasionally mean physical preservation in the historical narratives of the Gospels, Paul never uses it that way in his theological letters.
In the pastoral epistles, Paul consistently uses sozo to refer to spiritual, eschatological salvation.
Eschatological salvation, meaning the final, ultimate salvation from sin at the end of the age.
Yes. When Paul says sozo in Romans or Ephesians, he means saved from the wrath of God, not saved from a physical ailment. Jelinek argues we must apply Paul's consistent theological definition here.
Physical preservation is out. What about view 3? Saved through the birth of Christ. The childbearing with a capital C. It sounds very orthodox and Christ-centered.
It does, and it relies on a specific grammatical feature, the presence of the definite article in the Greek text, the childbearing. Proponents argue it points to the specific historical element of Mary giving birth to Jesus.
But Jelinek discards this as well. He views it as a highly strained, unnatural reading of the text.
It suddenly brings Mary, the mother of Jesus, into a context where she hasn't been mentioned at all.
Furthermore, nowhere else in the New Testament does Paul suggest that the incarnation itself is the specific mechanism of salvation for women exclusively. It breaks the logical flow of the entire passage.
If it is not physical safety, and it is not Mary having Jesus, that leaves us wrestling with the terrifying idea of spiritual salvation connected to the physical act of having babies.
Does this mean a woman who is infertile or a one who chooses to stay single cannot be saved? Are we looking at a system of salvation by works?
Because that contradicts the entirety of Pauline theology.
It absolutely contradicts Paul's core doctrine of justification by faith alone. Jelinek recognizes this massive theological tension.
If you take the verse hyperliterally, that the physical act of giving birth saves your soul, it shatters the rest of the New Testament.
So, to resolve this tension without ignoring the text, Jelinek reveals the interpretation he favors, which aligns with scholars like Douglas Moo and Thomas Schreiner.
He argues that Paul is using a literary device called synecdoche.
Synecdoche. For those who skipped high school English, a synecdoche is a figure of speech where a part of something is used to represent the whole thing.
Like a ship captain yelling, "All hands on deck." He doesn't just want disembodied hands. The hands represent the whole sailor.
In this interpretation, the highly specific act of childbearing stands in for the broader, comprehensive, God-ordained role of women as mothers, wives, and managers of the domestic household.
Childbearing is the quintessential part representing the whole of the domestic sphere.
I want to offer an analogy to clarify how this relates to salvation without turning it into a works-based, earn-your-way-to-heaven theology. Think about a military context.
Okay, let's see how that maps onto the text.
It is like a general declaring a soldier is proven through standing their post. Standing the post in the freezing rain doesn't make them a soldier.
They are a soldier because they enlisted, took the oath, and were inducted into the military.
But standing the post, faithfully executing the specific duty assigned to them, is the outward, visible manifestation of their inward identity as a dedicated soldier.
If they constantly abandon the post, it proves they lack the true identity of a soldier.
That conceptualizes Jelinek's argument beautifully. Fulfilling their God-ordained role, which Paul represents via synecdoche as childbearing, does not earn a woman her salvation.
Rather, embracing that role, living out God's design, is the outward evidence of a genuine saving faith. It is the proof of the inward reality.
There's a fascinating grammatical shift in verse 15 that actually supports this idea of outward evidence over individual works.
The grammar here is highly revealing. The verse starts with a singular future passive verb, she shall be saved.
But then, halfway through the sentence, it abruptly shifts to a plural subjunctive verb, if they continue. The Greek word is meinosin.
She shall be saved if they continue in faith and love and sanctity. Who is the they in the second half of the sentence?
Jelinek argues the they refers to the specific women in the Ephesian church, and by extension, Christian women generally.
The grammar shifts from the generic singular woman, perhaps thinking back to Eve, to the practical everyday reality of the plural women sitting in the Ephesian congregation.
Paul is clarifying that mere adherence to domestic roles isn't a magic spell for salvation. The role must be accompanied by continuing in faith, love, and holiness.
You cannot just bear children and expect salvation if you lack genuine faith in Christ.
This synecdoche interpretation ties perfectly back into the historical context we discussed at the very beginning of our conversation.
Why would Paul use childbearing as the ultimate symbol of obedience in this specific letter?
Because of what the false teachers were doing. According to 1 Timothy chapter 4, the false teachers in Ephesus were actively forbidding marriage.
They were likely degrading domesticity, telling women that having children and managing a home was unspiritual.
They promoted an ascetic lifestyle as a path to higher spiritual enlightenment. Paul uses childbearing as a synecdoche, precisely because it was the very thing the false teachers were attacking.
By embracing the domestic role, the women in Ephesus were actively rejecting the local heresy, refusing the false teachers, and proving their genuine faith in God's original created order.
We have traced this argument across incredible terrain.
We started with the demographics of modern churches, navigated the jewelry and fashion trends of Ephesian socialites, dissected the grammatical structures of authority and Greek conjunctions,
Traveled back to the temptation in the Garden of Eden, and finally wrestled with the enigma of salvation and synecdoche.
It is a phenomenal example of how intricate, demanding, and interconnected biblical exegesis can be when you dig past the surface.
As we wrap up, I want to summarize Jelinek's central thesis.
Go for it.
The complementarian reading of 1 Timothy 2, as presented and defended by Jelinek, argues that the teaching and authority restrictions placed on women in the church are not based on a lack of intellectual ability.
They are not based on an ontological inferiority or gullibility of women compared to men.
And they are not a temporary cultural fix for a localized Ephesian problem involving Gnostic myths or mystery cults.
According to this meticulous exegesis, the restrictions are based entirely on the original, pre-fall created order designed by God.
Where chronological priority established a pattern of male headship, a pattern that was disastrously subverted during the temptation in the garden, resulting in the fall.
This brings us to a crucial point about how we interact with information. If you are listening to this and wondering why we spent an hour debating Greek syntax and ancient hair-braiding techniques, this deep dive demonstrates the absolute necessity of looking beneath the surface text.
To understand an argument like Jelinek's, you have to grapple with the original languages. You have to reconstruct the historical contexts of ancient cities, and you have to map out Old Testament cross-references.
Whether you walk away from this session agreeing with Jelinek's complementarian conclusions, or whether you align with the egalitarian scholars who interpret the history, the grammar, and the theology differently, understanding the architectural framework of his argument is essential.
You cannot be genuinely well-informed on church history, institutional governance, or biblical interpretation without knowing the specific load-bearing pillars of this debate.
You have to know where the red wires are and what they connect to use our earlier analogy. You have to know the mechanics.
I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on, something that builds on this source material, but extends beyond the walls of first-century Ephesus.
When we look at any modern institution we participate in, be it a local church, a massive corporate office, a university system, or even the subtle dynamics within our own families, how often do we assume the leadership structures are just byproducts of modern efficiency?
How often do we assume they are just the result of pragmatic HR decisions or natural cultural evolution, rather than stopping to ask if they might be rooted in a specific ancient philosophy of human design?
That is a heavy, clarifying question. It forces us to look at the invisible blueprints governing our daily lives, which brings us right back to where we started in the clinic.
The text of 1 Timothy 2 is not a clean binary X-ray showing a simple, undeniable fracture. It is a complex, multi-layered scan of human history, theology, and language.
The diagnostic muddy waters are deep, but taking the time to map those waters reveals the incredible depth of the conversation shaping the structures of our world today.